and mine is just like yellow. Oh, hi.
Hi. Good evening, everyone. This is the Eclectic Radical once again. And as always, I'm your host, Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me tonight is my special guest, Justine Barron, journalist,
Eclectic Radical,
long COVID survivor, who is here to talk with us about ableism tonight.
Eclectic Radical,
long COVID survivor, who is here to talk with us about ableism.
You know what? I just realized I have you.
long COVID survivor.
Okay. That was my mistake. I had you open on another screen. And I
That
was like, what
that
the
explains
heck?
it. That explains
I'm
it.
so sorry about that, but we're off to a good start.
We've got the ice broken now, definitely. So tell any of our guests who don't know you about yourself.
Cool. Okay. So professionally right now I'm writing a book that'll be out in April called They Killed Freddie Gray, The Anatomy of a Police Brutality.
Oh, yes. Freddie Gray. I remember.
So, I have knowledge about what really happened to him and how it was covered up by a lot of people, like a conspiracy to cover up. Evidence that was never shared with the public, and a great story about like a horrible tragedy, but also the way, the people who saw it were cut out of the story so that the police and prosecutors could tell a story that would be more favorable to them. So that's the professional stuff. And I've done some journalism, obviously. And then personally, I've been disabled. Like I've had chronic illness my whole life, and I've been like disabled about 10 years. And then on top of that, which was pre-existing, I got long COVID. So I have like another chronic illness. And so, just like in the last few years, I've become really attuned to ableism and across the political spectrum. I had considered myself like a Bernie bro leftist, but I do feel like betrayed by the leftists with just so much rampant ableism, and so just like the way that you tweet is sensitive to these issues, and I don't find that among a lot of like the left.
Well, and I think, and I admit, I've seen what you're talking about. A lot of stuff. I mean, when you see people start to talk about COVID like people with comorbidities are somehow to blame for their comorbidities, and that other people shouldn't have to be bothered with the comorbidities of others as if it's not their problem.
Right.
And I don't understand that. How do you ask a group of the population to never live a normal life again so you can have the normal life you want?
Yeah.
Because at minimum, that's what we're talking about. You take eugenics and just wanting disabled people to die out of the equation, and at the very minimum, you're expecting anybody immunocompromised to stay at home for the rest of their lives so that you can go to the bar. But they can't anymore now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're tapping into some really deep biases that people have towards the disabled and elderly that are sort of independent of their own lifestyles and their own COVID issues and masks. If it were just about them wearing masks, then maybe I could entertain the conversation about how uncomfortable that is for them, maybe, right? But I've seen this bias outside of that. I see it around when people talk about how much disabled people have benefited from these food delivery apps. As problematic as that business structure is, as harmful as it is, people are getting fed that weren't getting fed.
Sure.
And we're getting the food we actually need,
Sure.
which can be hard to obtain. And so even that conversation, people being angry that we might need that, intolerant towards it, and just preferring that we die or starve than get what we need. And that doesn't even necessarily affect them because those apps continue whether or not disabled people use them.
And let's be honest, how many people who are criticizing them really don't use them?
Right.
Because
yeah.
Well, I mean, they're all still in business, which means people who can afford to use them must be. And the people who seem most blasé, at least on the COVID issue, about asking disabled people to make unreasonable accommodations when they're not willing to make reasonable ones, they're usually well off. We're not talking about the poor usually. I'm not saying that the poor aren't ableist, but they're not usually the ones making these blanket statements.
No, God, no. Are you kidding? Like, no, poor people don't have the time or the interest, and they're also like in survival mode, and disabled people are poor. So, generally, like, I don't know if your audience would be aware of what happens when you become disabled, but usually income goes to zero for a very long time. And if you're lucky and you can fight to get some form of disability, at max, you're going to get maybe $1,200. Like at max. I'm privileged to have that through SSDI, but it was like, and I'm like, I can't even believe how it came through for me.
And let's talk about the folks who don't ever get SSDI and are stuck on SSI. And the fact that even before COVID, SSI had the absolutely eugenicist idea that people can't get married if they have SSI.
Yes, totally. Yes. Income, and there's also an income cap, like not an income, asset cap. So you can't have
asset caps.
And the crazy thing is, like, a lot of people don't really understand this. And part of the problem is because we're so hated. And like, for me, it comes down to just kind of, okay, as an aside, I'll say this is kind of my philosophy on these things, all of it across the board. People are very anxious and fearful of death and disease. They're disgusted by it when they see it in their families. Sometimes people will say, well, my mother's disabled, so I'm allowed to say these things. And I'm thinking, I don't think you actually like your mother. So like, people are so horrified by death and disease that they can't accommodate it in their mindset, and they want it out of they just don't want to hear about it. And that's, I think, what drives all of this.
I don't understand that. I mean, I register what you're saying. Yeah. I understand what you're saying. It's not that I don't understand I can't understand how people can be like that.
I do.
I sound naive, I know, and I'm not really naive. I understand in an intellectual sense that these things happen. And I have experienced a lot of people like this in my life on various levels. So it's not that I don't know these people, it's just I don't understand it.
I think I do, because I think I've had a lot of that bias. Mine was born out of like my own chronic illness and my mother's persistent illnesses. And like and then that before I became fully disabled, I had the ability to overcome some of my illnesses and manage them and become very healthy. And so I understand that became a zero-sum game for me in my head, where I was anxious about and disgusted by like health concerns. I was not getting certain tests that I needed because I didn't want to face what I might have, inherited. So I do understand that bias. I would never say that I was like as disgustingly biased as a lot of what I see, but people really associate health with virtue. You see it all over the place. People brag about having not gotten COVID, which they probably did and didn't realize.
I haven't gotten COVID, but I don't see it as something to brag about. It's just I've been trying to protect myself and my wife, who has multiple comorbidities and who I would prefer not die.
Yeah. Although it's possible you may have had it and not known it. So it's always
possible.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like the association with health and virtue is just like such a huge thing in our society. Yeah, and that, I mean, the hatred part of it is
that's something else I don't understand, is how does health become virtue?
Because people think that the amount of work that they put into their physical and mental health is the most difficult achievement they could ever have, conquered. And, what I would say is like, good for you, but it's actually harder to have a disability or disease. Like that is a more difficult challenge, So I think that's part of it. Similar to like classism, the way that wealthy people think that it's a virtue because they worked to get there.
Well, I know that Teddy Roosevelt was obsessed with health, but that was because he was actually very sickly, and he went out of his way to prove that he was as manly a man as anybody who wasn't sickly. And as a result, he actually died much younger than most of his peers.
Yeah. I think we'll be all a lot better off when people acknowledge their disabilities and weaknesses. I think it's a much bigger percentage of the population than we say. Mental neurodivergence, physical disabilities. I think people don't. I run into this a lot where people will say things to me like, well, according to such and such, I have a disability, but I don't take that as part of my identity. I don't play identity games,
Yeah, I've just always felt like, and maybe this is silly, I don't know, I have a handful of what I would of what are technically invisible disabilities. I have epilepsy, but I have a weird relationship with epilepsy because I've had the imaginary getting better experience and believing I wasn't disabled before.
Yeah.
And then I had seizures again and actually ended up losing a job because of it.
Oh.
And being injured at another one because of it. It was very disturbing at the time, both times. And then now I haven't had seizures for years. And in theory, I am better. But, and this is an important but, the government doesn't see it that way. The government says if you got better once and then relapsed and then got better again, you can't, your being better can't be trusted.
How does that show up for you with the government? Like, do they?
Well, I can't ever get a driver's license because I've relapsed. If I had had seizures as a teenager, I could drive. Because if I had seizures as a teenager and grew out of them, that's not a permanent disability. But because I had seizures again as an adult.
Wow. I did not know that. Everything that you and I have been through with our jobs and other restrictions, like what you're talking about, there's so little information out there for people. And I think it's because, of that anxiety and fear and disgust, they don't want to look into it. But we're like here with the information because it's going to happen to them. We're ready.
I've never thought of not being able to drive as a disability because I can still do all the physical things that somebody would think of as being not being able to do would be the disability. But at the same time, in a very real way, in modern capitalist America, not being able to drive is a huge disability.
It really is. And, if something else happened to you where a car, for me, if something else happened where a car became much more important for you, you would notice that it's a disability. It's funny, my whole journey with kind of like leftism and its ableism started where I tweeted, and you may not agree with this, but I tweeted like a car tax because they were talking about a possible car tax at one point. I said a car tax is a disability tax because in fact, a lot of disabled people depend on their cars. Like, I'm not saying that it's not, cars don't have some kind of evil place in this society. I'm not sure about that. But a lot of us need it to get to appointments. We can't wait for buses, especially now without mask mandates on transit.
Exactly.
And so that's when I saw the backlash I got from that simple little tweet, like people just vile and hateful and not believing. Like they don't understand our lives at all. When these things come up, like that whole thing with Jorts the cat and the food delivery app, there was like an argument. I just realized like nobody understands what our lives are like because we don't have any visibility, because we're not invited to talk about being disabled, and because people are so uncomfortable by these conversations. I mean, I have so many friends that are just kind of like, they shut off and they don't want to hear it. And to them, it's whining. When to me, it's like, you don't want to hear about my body turning on itself? Because I think that's interesting. Like, what's more interesting than that, you know?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of kind of feel the same way you do about some of it. Is I think that some topics, I find some of the topics about illness and recovery and health are extremely interesting. I also think some of the topics about how, you know, some things you don't ever really recover from and you have to adapt instead are also really interesting. And proof that humans really are amazingly adaptable and impressive creatures.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I guess maybe that's where the not understanding comes from, because when I see someone who has to deal with all the daily problems that come from being in a wheelchair instead of walking around, I feel really, really, I mean, I don't want to try to superheroize people either.
Right.
But it's like you said, dealing with the disability is much harder than becoming super healthy, but not ever having to be, who's ever going to be inconvenienced in life by their amazing good health and physical condition?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would like people to be interested, because if they're interested, they could start learning. And then when it happens to them, they don't go suicidal. They don't want to die. They have resources and knowledge, and they could participate in the conversation. And also they could not burden us. Like right now, you know, all these people that are becoming newly disabled by long COVID.
Yes.
It's like I mean, honestly, the disability community is talking about it. It's kind of like, okay,
Yes.
here for you, but like, hello, we've been sick this whole time. This isn't just some, you know, there's communities where newly disabled people by long COVID are like demanding resources that we all want, you know?
Yeah.
They let us just suffer like this. It's like, welcome to the world.
Yeah, sadly.
Yeah, sorry to go on and on.
No, you're right. Because, and you know, the same thing, I mean, you can see lots of these analogies where people are suddenly, it's so terrible to be me. People are restricting my freedom. And it's like, well, welcome to what it's like to be poor or disabled or Black or whatever.
Right.
And I'm not trying to say that everything is equivalent to everything else when I say that. It's that people people who aren't rich, white, and healthy face all these challenges that people who are rich, white, and healthy don't face.
They don't face them, or they don't think they do, or they're, you know, they will. That's the thing.
Well,
like that's the one category everybody can go into, and almost everybody does.
Yes, that's a good point. But if you're wealthy and disabled, it's sometimes a little different than being poor and disabled.
Oh, it's totally different. It's all the difference. Yeah. I mean, I have SSDI, and it would not be possible for me to live on that. So I get help, you know, like super embarrassing. I had been self-sufficient forever, but so yeah, I would be dead and would be homeless, and I have been homeless, but like, and that's the thing, like most of the homeless population is disabled.
Of course, yes.
They say half, but I'm sure it's more, you know?
It's hard to be sure. I would say that if they weren't disabled before they were homeless, that some of the conditions of being homeless have given them disabilities in the form of mental health issues that come from the added stresses of being homeless.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think people understand that there's nothing in place. You know, you see a lot of arguments where people are like, oh, but there's benefits from work. And I don't know if anyone has, I don't know if you've applied for short-term disability before, but I had a regular job. I was getting off disability, and the long COVID was so bad I couldn't sustain it. When did the short-term disability, I didn't get that money until a year later. And the only reason I got it was because I was so assertive about fighting through denials. And I have the like cognitive and whatever privilege to do that.
You know how my wife got her, how my wife got her disability? So there are lawyers who specialize in getting disabled people their disability in exchange for a great big, well, I shouldn't say great big, it's not horrific, but in exchange for a piece of the back payment that they give you as a lump sum. In my wife's case, the lawyer wanted a percentage of the lump sum she got for her SSI approval, and then what she got for her disability approval was a smaller percentage. And a lot of people only have their disability because they realized there were lawyers like that.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, it's predatory.
Yes.
The lawyers are only able to do this because it's guaranteed money with the approval. And so it's easy for them to say, if they know their client is definitely disabled, it's easy for them to say, yes, we're going to get you your disability. And their clients will be genuinely grateful and feel like it was worth it. But it's only necessary because the system is set up to deny people, which incentivizes lawyers to practice disability law.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm aware of that. It is a sizable chunk because it's such little money.
Yes.
And the other thing about disability is like Medicare is great. My prescription drug costs are very low, but it's only 80%.
Yes.
And when there's a catastrophe, I have to come up with that 20%.
20%.
We're talking about 20% of like tens of thousands of dollars. And then if you can get something to fill the gap, but a lot of times that's $500. So then you're left with a few $100 for rent, food, everything.
And my wife was able to do this and go through this process and not be working because I was working full time, which, not everybody has. Not everybody has the luxury of a spouse who's working full time.
Yeah. And to be honest, for women, I mean, your wife is very lucky, but, I was married when my disability hit. I'm not, and I'm not going to speak to that situation. I can't legally. But anyway, the common trend is for sick women to get left, and it's so bad that like when women get cancer, they often get speeches.
I know that Newt Gingrich and John McCain both divorced their sick wives. I remember that.
Yeah. It's like a whole thing, So that's the other part of it is that sometimes, you'll think, okay, I have this spouse, so I'm just going to be disabled and take care of myself. And then it's like, there's certain sort of social expectations of being a spouse that get hard to meet when you're disabled or sick. And then, you know what I mean? And so
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Or whatever, everything changes when people get sick, all kinds of dynamics change. So there's just, the point is that there's so many layers of vulnerability.
Oh, definitely. This is just this area where I realize I think so completely differently from other human beings, and I wonder about myself.
Yeah. Just a good person, I guess. But,
well, no, I don't want to give myself that much credit because I know myself. I know what my problems are too.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to give myself credit or pretend I'm better than I am. It's just I don't think the same way as other people.
Yeah. Maybe I don't know why. I have all the health, not all, but I have like lots of health problems and have been around that my whole life. And yet I can understand ableism. I feel like I understand it really well because I have so much internalized.
Well, and see, I feel like it makes sense that if you feel that way about yourself, you're going to feel that way about other people too.
Right. Disgusted with the weakness.
And I think there are a lot of people, this is the point where I can start to understand a little bit. I think there are people who are disgusted with themselves in the first place.
Right.
And they externalize that disgust onto other people in the same way that people internalize it about themselves.
Yeah.
So I can see that. That makes sense.
I think ableism is very, very primal in that way. And I think it is connected to self-hatred. I think a lot of self-hatred is ableism, because if you think about it, really basically it's just ability.
I mean, I think that's true to some extent of all bigotry, and that you're projecting something you don't like about yourself onto someone else.
Yeah.
The best example I can think of is that white Christians who really do run the world like to say that Jews run the world.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you're projecting that onto the people you don't like. You run the world.
Right. Yeah, I got into a little spat on Twitter because I had a thread that kind of took off. Maybe my biggest whatever. But it was about internalized ableism.
Yeah.
And I sort of was saying, there was somebody who had these really dark thoughts. She was sort of saying that like half, I think she said like, I think half of disability Twitter are just like feeling sorry for themselves kind of shit,
I saw that. You showed that to me. Yeah.
Right. And so my thread was sort of like, these are deep issues, internalized ableism. And so somebody really fought with me that I was like giving this lady a pass and like therefore excusing this woman from just being abusive. But I don't know, maybe it's my own naivete, but I actually
didn't see it as fighting, but I did feel like I did say I felt like you were giving her a pass. This was us again.
No, it wasn't you. It wasn't you.
Was it? I thought I said something like that.
Yeah, no, this was somebody else. And I didn't hear it much. And I understood what people were saying. I didn't give her a pass at all. It was.
I know. You explained that too.
Yeah, I just do feel like it's sort of like there is a level of healing that people need to have around their anxiety of illness and death and disability, that if that happens, there'll be less bigotry, so maybe that's excusing abusiveness. It's really not, but it's also kind of like, I see through your ableism. I see that you can't handle illness and death because you're scared, and I don't mean to get so like philosophical, but I really feel that's what it is,
I feel like now I know why I have a hard time understanding non-acceptance, and it's just because the 80s brainwashing on television that was supposed to make us the 80s TV brainwashing that was supposed to make us just all love each other no matter what just worked a little too well on me. I think that in a silly and childish way, I have a view of race and class and how they shouldn't matter and how people should be equal despite everything that comes from stuff like MASH and Different Strokes.
God, those shows didn't work on me at all. I don't know. But Different Strokes was like, Different Strokes was a little, you have like this adoption story.
But so here's what's so weird about Different Strokes. First,
I really don't remember it that well, but go ahead.
Different Strokes is based on the almost completely unrealistic idea that this man was deeply and closely friends with his chauffeur and his housekeeper. So that's unrealistic. That's probably really unrealistic. But it's based on the idea that he was such deeply friends and so deeply loved his chauffeur and his housekeeper who had stuck with him through his being widowed, that he felt the need to adopt their children. And it's that the premise is really hard to believe now.
Yeah, a lot of the content then, because I'm thinking of like the Breakfast Club, where it's like we're going to highlight everyone's differences and then kind of smash them. And that was sort of the way the content always went, right?
Yes, but it was more than that too. It was, so one of the things I remember, especially in retrospect, being epileptic now, there is an episode where Arnold and Willis make friends with a street performer in Central Park. And at first, people are very concerned that they're making friends with this riffraff. Only the reason she's a street performer is she can't hold down a regular job because she's epileptic.
Oh, okay.
And when they find that out, their attitude changes 100%. And they're very supportive, and they're very angry at Arnold and Willis for rejecting her because of her epilepsy.
What were your parents like? Or your household, I should say.
So we grew up watching MASH and Different Strokes together. And my parents, it's hard. I'm not going to say that my parents were not racist. My father had certain stereotypical ideas about certain groups, but that did not seem to impact his ability to be friends with or work with people. I feel like he was working to overcome those feelings in himself.
Interesting.
And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit. But he's also the person who told me that cops are not your friends, and the only difference between cops and criminals is the badge.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting. The reason I asked is because I processed those 80s shows in a very cynical way, because my parents were very cynical. And my mother was like violently repulsed at all 1980s content.
Okay, so
and then do you remember those Fox TV shows came? What was it? Married with Children and The Simpsons, and they were so harsh, and that was the world I'm related to.
So in that case, then I will explain my parents in a way that will make you understand my childhood. My mother was a substitute teacher who was devoted to the idea of being a substitute teacher because she got to teach more kids that way in more different places, in more different settings.
Yeah.
And when she couldn't be a substitute teacher anymore, she became an independent studies teacher working with kids who had been expelled, because that gave her the ability to go and meet with kids one-on-one in different places. And so she was very, very serious about being a teacher. And it meant that as a substitute teacher, she made less money than people who had a guaranteed class to teach. Sometimes there wasn't work. As an independent studies teacher, she was moving around all the time and spending her own money on gas. And sure, gas and lunch were tax deductible, but that's still expenses of gas and lunch on a teacher's pay.
Right.
And my dad was a social worker in the welfare system who was burnt out by the welfare system because he thought it should do more to help people, as opposed to just doing the bare minimum.
Yeah.
On the one hand, he thought there were really people who were taking advantage of the system, and he was upset by that. But on the other hand, he felt like the majority of people were not, and the people who needed help were not getting help. They were getting the bare minimum.
Right.
And the bare minimum in a way that was designed to keep people dependent and dissatisfied.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my father was a conservative, but a weird conservative.
Yeah, but conservative was different back then. My dad and I were talking about that last night too. Just the way the parties have, it was different. There, it was. I think back
Well,
then it was.
but remember, as an example of how it was different, because the perfect example is the huge bundle of contradictions that was Barry Goldwater, who was hard to define, because on the one hand, if you had to choose one single politician to give credit for Roe lasting as long as it did, it would have to be Barry Goldwater.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because there was a moment when Ronald Reagan absolutely needed Barry Goldwater's blue slip to make William Rehnquist Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And in order to get that blue slip, Ronald Reagan had to promise to appoint pro-choice justices because Goldwater wanted abortion to stay legal.
Oh, what is a blue chip?
A blue slip. So this is something that is out of fashion now. For a while, Democrats were still respecting them, but the Republicans weren't. And now I believe the whole idea is just gone. But when you appoint a federal judge, you get what are called blue slips from the senators from his state. And those blue slips are their endorsement of your appointment of this judge. And it used to be that blue slips were taken very seriously by the Senate Judiciary Committee. And no judge appointed by any president got out of the Judiciary Committee without blue slips from both senators from their state. It was unheard of to appoint a federal judge that the senators from their state didn't want. And of course, William Rehnquist was from Arizona, as was Barry Goldwater. So the blue slip had to come from Barry Goldwater, who was the most pro-choice senator in the Senate, which people have a hard time understanding now because his reputation is as a conservative Republican.
Right.
But he was the most pro-choice senator in the Senate in the 1980s.
Oh, that's
and
really
in order to get the Chief Justice he wanted, Ronald Reagan had to appoint people like John Paul Stevens and Sandra Day O'Connor, who had many faults, but opposition to abortion was not on the list.
Yeah, it was very different. Republican or conservative had more to do with an idea about big government, I think, back then.
But when you consider how those Republican votes mattered over the years.
Yeah. No, I see your point.
So Barry Goldwater did more to protect Roe versus Wade as an ongoing legal precedent than any other senator in U.S. history.
Yeah. But I want to go back to the 80s TV because, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because I was thinking just the other day about, and I don't remember her name, but she was on the Facts of Life, and she was disabled. And she was like a fifth character brought in every now and then.
I know who you mean.
And I don't know what
See, I remember Kathy from Different Strokes, who was Arnold's friend.
I remember Different Strokes enough to talk about it, but the Facts of Life, she was a big deal.
Like that was a spin-off of Different Strokes.
Right.
It was their housekeeper.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But I came a little later.
No, I know.
I remember her name, and I don't know if it was. I don't think it was Down syndrome. She had some recognizable disability, and
Yes.
she was a comedian on the show.
Yeah.
But every storyline was like very maudlin, inspiration porn. But at the same time, it was probably like the most representation. I always think about like, what would disability, okay, we need more disability representation for sure. There's like, right now there's this, I watched this show, I'm autistic, and I watched this show, The Good Doctor. I watched like one episode, okay? And I'm like, this is, I don't know. I don't want to criticize anyone, but he does this like, and maybe the actor's autistic, I'm not sure, but the performance of a flat voice is like so extreme, you know? It's so like over the top. And it's also like very, you know, like he's special to a degree that's like magical. I mean, it's almost like, oh wait, didn't the Facts of Life?
Yes, this is a yes. This is a yes. The character on the Facts of Life died of AIDS.
Oh wow, man, I don't remember that. Yeah, like everything in the 80s was very like inspiration driven, you know?
Well, there was.
But on the plus side, that meant more representation.
But at the same time, in the episode about drugs.
Yeah, I do remember that, Nancy Reagan.
At the high school is kind of the bad guy.
Who is?
And so Willis wants to impress this girl who says she's looking for cocaine, and so he pretends to do drugs,
right,
to get her together with kids he knows deals, so he can get together with this girl.
Yeah.
Only this girl is an undercover cop who's trying to bust drug dealers in high school. She's not really underage.
Okay.
So this undercover cop character is kind of the villain. And this is someone who's cynically willing to know this kid, to use this kid who she knows is just pretending to do drugs in order to spend time with her, in order to catch real dealers. So it's really ruthless what she's doing.
Yeah.
And they presented this very honestly. And I don't think I've ever really forgotten that. They presented this cop who would later on be hero in 21 Jump Street, this same concept.
Wow.
But they present this undercover cop in a high school as this clear and present danger to the kids in the school. And this is an 80s sitcom.
Well, I wonder if some of that like inspiration model for the 80s sitcom actually meant more representation. Because I wonder if when shows became like more cynical and cool and less inspiration oriented, that they actually stopped representing.
Well, there was, so let's be honest. If you care enough about inspiration to want to inspire some sort of racial harmony, to make a really idealistically sappy but genuinely anti-racist show that actually makes trying to inspire people to be anti-racist and anti-ableist and anti every sort of bad thing part of its central premise. I mean, people, when you're going to have these sorts of characters, if you care about these sorts of stories, even if it comes from this what looks like inspiration porn now, it looks like inspiration porn now so much because we've become so cynical since then. And the 80s is what did it, because this stuff was sold as a product and and used to hide the reality.
I mean, any character in a show like Seinfeld or even Friends that had a difference of any sort was somebody that was laughed at.
Yes.
And like
exactly.
And so, okay, that's not good. Is inspiration porn better? And it's sort of like, well, I don't know. I mean, the Facts of Life character, and I really wish I could remember her name, but I mean, she was a comedian.
Yes.
She wasn't just like a grocery store worker, you know? And yeah, it was corny as all hell, but it's certainly like better than what Seinfeld did with characters.
There's this moment, and it's like the defining moment of Different Strokes for me, because it's always how I think of Conrad Bain every time. But there's this 2-part episode that framed the end of one season and the beginning of the next, where Arnold makes friends with this girl who has a chronic illness. And her father is Dabney Coleman. and Dabney Coleman is in some business deal with Conrad Bain, and because of that, Conrad Bain is spending time at the hospital, and Arnold is spending time with little girl. And Dabney Coleman doesn't care because it's Conrad Bain's son. And then he finds out it's his black adopted son, and he has this moment, and he doesn't show Conrad Bain because he doesn't want to blow the business deal, but he basically forbids his daughter from playing with Arnold. And they sneak off together, and and Dabney Coleman scares everybody by reporting his kid missing, and they're looking for it, and he finds out at the end that he told his daughter. And Conrad Bain looks at Dabney Coleman with this look of just utter contempt, like, you're not even a human being to me anymore. And he says, "Are you a bigot, Tom?" And it's just that moment where the person that you're sort of positioned to think of as the perfect father is now putting this moment of perfect disapproval onto the worst thing in the world from his point of view.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have to say that whether it's good, I believe that inspiration porn of that sort kind of made me believe that we really should treat each other like that.
Yeah.
And in that case, if it makes anybody, if it actually takes like that on at least some people, does it have some value, or is it worthless?
Yeah, I mean, I think where it becomes a problem, you mentioned chronic illness, and I've been thinking a lot about, like, because I write scripts as well, and I was thinking, like, a parody of, like, sick girl movies, like movies where the girl is sick and then she kind of, like, lives in a bubble or is attached to machines. And then, like, the problem with inspiration porn is when they're like, the inspiring moment is when she gets to detach from all her machines and go running into the woods with the love of her life. And it's like, actually, that's the most dangerous, horrifying part of those movies.
Yes.
Because she needs those machines, and I understand that so well, because having been, like, romanced by people that were more able-bodied than me, and, like, them wanting this adventure, and then me just, like, suffering constantly while they swept me off my feet, and I was
and that's one of the things. Different Strokes didn't have characters like that get better.
Right.
I mean, Kathy, Arnold's little friend on the crutches with muscular dystrophy, wasn't ever going to stop having muscular dystrophy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think the ability part of it, I've been thinking about this a lot. I was talking with, I'm in this disability group. We meet twice a month. We were talking about how loaded the word accomplishment is, because, like I said, I was able-bodied for a while, and I would, like, climb this mountain near my house in Los Angeles, and I would literally climb the whole mountain. I mean, I worked up to it, and it felt great, and it was fucking fun, and I miss it, and I'll probably never get to do it again. But it wasn't harder than having a migraine and trying to feed myself. Like, that is harder. And when you think about accomplishment, like, the problem with inspiration porn is that it doesn't understand that the accomplishment is just being and existing. It doesn't have to be like something else. It doesn't have to be looking like an abled person,
And that's why I think that this particular form of the propaganda took with me, because Arnold and Willis were not encouraged by their father to act like white kids.
Right.
They were not encouraged by their sister to act like white kids. They were not told to only have white friends or only hang out with the rich kids. Arnold and Willis at one point were still going to their school in the bad neighborhood because he didn't want to take them away from their friends. And so there wasn't this demand that people live up, because in the real world, in the real world, when a rich white person adopts an orphan black kid, they almost always demand that they live up to some impossible standard of whiteness that will allow them to imprint upon this child the adult that they want them to be.
Right.
And that's not what happens in Different Strokes.
Yeah, I wish I remembered it better. I think I just had a crush on the blonde girl.
Which is not, which, you know, so did Todd Bridges. And so.
And her sister was on Growing Pains. I think they were sisters, and I think they were Jewish. I always liked, well, they had the last name Gold, so it was always like very exciting because there aren't that
yes,
many.
Tracy Gold, yes.
It's gotten a little better, but especially back then, there were like very few Jewish actresses, you know? So that's pretty much what I remember. But I remember the drug episode. I kind of have my own thing. Yeah, I think there is a way in which we sort of all look at TV now, TV shows. Mm-hmm. We're so influenced by that Seinfeld mindset that, like, for instance, I was going to say like SVU, like the Law and Order stuff, right? Okay, yes. So obviously I critique policing now. This is my work. And so I know this is propaganda. Like, I know what I'm watching. Yes. I'm not mistaken. But sometimes a lot of these shows, like what you're saying with Different Strokes, there's like another message going on, right? So one thing I think SVU does that I don't know any other show that does, or any other content, even the most like politically savvy content, is it shows that there's like a genocide of women, you know, like sexual, yes. That it's genocidal, that it's just like it happens that much, and it doesn't hold back from that at all.
Yes.
It's not, and it doesn't individualize the cases. It sort of sees it within the context. And I feel like that, you know, that draws me to that show.
Yes, and I can understand that.
Right. And so, yeah, I think sometimes we're kind of like, especially, you know, all the hit media people. I mean, we're talking about in this way. It gives me a chance to kind of think about these things.
Loved, and this may be the closest thing to an anti-propaganda cop show ever made when you think about it, but I loved Hill Street Blues.
I don't remember that, to be honest.
See, I watched reruns of that, plus I'm old, but I loved Hill Street Blues. One of the most important aspects of Hill Street Blues was the degree to which the honest characters were kind of abnormal.
Yeah.
There were not any other police captains as honest as the primary, you don't call them leads in an ensemble cast, but there were no other officers of equal rank as honest as the captain of the Hill Street precinct. He was an extreme anomaly in his police department.
Yeah.
Some of the detectives working for him were really good, but I mean, they all had problems. There's a lot of honesty about street justice and cops mediating issues out in the streets instead of arresting people. And you think about that and you kind of wonder, well, why did they make cops stop doing that and arrest more people instead?
Yeah.
Not that saying that it's right, because they were breaking the rules even then.
Yeah.
But that sort of street justice prevented people from being criminalized. I'm not saying that cops were better then, they weren't. And the show is very honest about how bad many cops were. It just makes too many characters too good to be true or too likable. But even those characters have problems like getting caught cheating on their taxes because of involvement with gambling that cops shouldn't be having.
Right. Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. On SVU, there was a character who got into gambling. And I was like, they must have sort of picked a vice by committee, because that's sort of the one they could get away with. Because I think what you're talking about is like before these issues became.
They do all of them on Hill Street Blues. They have cops who do drugs. They have cops who drink. They have cops who have sex addictions. They have cops who sleep with married women. All the cop problems.
I mean, I think right now to show cops like getting away with their own criminality, or being sort of impaired in a way that could harm people, it's too triggering for a lot of
Yes,
people.
yes.
And it probably was then too. Like there was probably a very specific audience for that show that didn't include people that were like harmed by police regularly. You know what I mean?
Well, I would say though that if you're that I don't think people who are harmed by police are ever the target audience of any cop show.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
I think that if you were someone, I think that you would watch the more honest cop show as opposed to the more propaganda cop show.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at the episode of Dragnet where they basically convince this poor kid that racial profiling is good and he should like it.
Oh.
That's really in an episode of Dragnet from the 1960s where Joe and Harry Morgan basically teach this poor kid that he should be good like his parents.
Yeah. I mean, you're right about that. You're right that these. Yeah, I mean, Law and Order is like a guilty thing for me.
No, and I'm not trying to call anybody out. I'm trying to put various cop shows in their context and perspective. Dragnet, of course, is the prototypical propaganda, literally.
Yeah.
The LAPD funded it. The technical consultants went on to be people like Joseph Wambaugh and Gene Roddenberry.
Right. Yeah, I definitely had thought when I was younger, I definitely didn't understand when I got to Baltimore and started working on Baltimore crime.
Oh, yes.
It became really clear to me that The Wire was like extremely divisive in Baltimore.
I bet.
Not entirely along racial lines, but in part. And that's a show that a lot of people don't understand is like very propaganda. Like,
yeah, it seems like it's not, but it is.
Yeah, like SVU has more sort of nuance to me than
like how The Shield, which portrayed police corruption in a very honest way, also justified and glamorized it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, but I think like that period of television, I didn't know this was going to be a TV combo, but I'm into it. Like, I think that period of television, which I think was like the 2000s, it was all sort of focused on that. It was all like sexy anti-heroes. It was Mad Men and The Sopranos and like that, that was the whole thing. And then, and all of those shows would kind of like open a curtain to the harm done by the lead to a point, but you still had to like the lead and want to be them,
Yeah. And there were shows that were more honest about the law. If you watch some of the early episodes of Perry Mason, the relationship between Perry Mason and Lieutenant Tragg is in no way friendly or amicable or cooperative. Lieutenant Tragg is looking for a reason to arrest Perry Mason. Hamilton Berger hates Perry Mason and wants his career ruined. And these are the Law and Order people. The good guy's a defense attorney.
Yeah.
And it's not like Matlock later on, where cops are friends with the defense lawyer. It's this very antagonistic, hard-boiled relationship.
The last time I watched The Wire, I realized how anti-Semitic the defense attorneys were,
Yes.
The writer being Jewish, like very, very, very interesting. All this all this stuff about like Jewish identity and anti-Semitism has been coming up for me lately since all the commentary around Kanye and Kyrie. But that David Simon, like his own it's so fucking fascinating. I don't know if anyone's ever written about that, but you know what I mean, right? Like these nebbishy, amoral attorneys.
Well, the word shyster was originally a slur against Jewish people and not lawyers.
Right. Right.
And it became it became associated with a certain kind of lawyer because of anti-Semitic associations of that certain kind of lawyer with Jewish people.
Yeah. Yeah, just going back to disability for a second, like
Yes.
some stuff I haven't really sorted out is kind of, I really feel aware of like sexism and ableism and where those like intersect real strong.
Yes.
Because and it's so essential. It's like the portrayals I see these days that are so ableist are sort of like you're lazy, you're whiny, you're hysterical. Yeah. You don't really have a disease. You just kind of like to trumpet it as an identity. All of that is very sexist,
Mm-hmm.
Judaism and ableism is like something I haven't really explored where they intersect, but there is sort of if you just think, for instance, like Bernie Sanders, when he ran for president, it was so anti-Semitic the way people talked about him.
Yeah.
His hands, his body. And the thing is, like, Bernie Sanders is like a horse. I mean, he's like, he scares me how healthy he is. Even with a heart attack. But there must be some kind of thing, and I'm honestly just thinking about this off the top of my head. I've never thought about it, but like Jewish bodies, like being more diseased, being inappropriate.
So let's remember that the most ableist, well, let's connect historical context first. So the one thing that people keep comparing COVID to is the Spanish flu. Well, what came after the Spanish flu? The Roaring 20s, the Great Depression, and the Holocaust.
Right.
Now, one of the reasons that Nazis began to become popular is Nazis were complaining about the expense to the state of providing all these various help that the Weimar Republic legitimately did give disabled people.
Yeah.
And there was a great complaint about the cost of disabled pensions and a great many discussions about what to do with mentally ill people and people who had been crippled by the Spanish flu. Yeah. And this led to the sort of eugenics that justified Nazism.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing that's why the left has sort of like lost. Yeah.
And the Nazis went directly from, this intense ableism to this intense queer phobia.
Yes.
To this intense anti-Semitism, and they just swung the German people with them because they knew what buttons to push to take advantage of their own cultural vulnerabilities.
Right. Okay. So the amount of ableism that we're seeing on the left, even just on Twitter, but also if you go to a DSA meeting and you try to ask for accommodations, just like the same old shit. Yeah. It's rough. It's intense. It's as vile and aggressive as I see among Republicans. So this is, or right wingers or Trumpists. So this is my question. It's like, these people call themselves anti-fascists. How do we get them to understand that like ableism is fascism, and making jokes about ableism or saying, oh, are you going to call me an ableist now? Like that is fascism. And they're supposed to be anti-fascists. Or is it like, my opinion is I'm done with all of it. But I also feel like, wow, you guys have really, I actually think like the Bernie Sanders movement has died as a result of
this. There was never a Bernie Sanders movement.
Okay.
There were two political campaigns that pulled a lot of people together and created the illusion of a movement, especially when he ran the second time and justified many of the hopes and optimism of the people who projected this movement into imaginary existence. But I mean, Bernie said from the beginning, let's be clear about this. Bernie said from the beginning there would be no third party candidacies. He would support the nominee if he lost. He was running because he intended to win, but he was not going to break up the Democratic Party or be a Ralph Nader. I mean, he never said otherwise.
Yeah.
Yet there were all these expectations from people that Bernie would do X, Y, or Z when he had always made it clear that he would not.
All right, well, let me put it another way then. The
But no, I
Medicare
used
for
to
all
believe very strongly in the Bernie movement, and it hurts me to say this, by the way.
Yeah, well, me too. But okay, so even just say, all right, what I'm talking about is there's still a large contingent of people that came out of the ideas about Medicare for all,
Yes.
especially that one. And disabled people, I got fooled because disabled people were used to sell that. But those people right now don't sound like they care about disabled people. They don't care about SSDI payments. They don't care. They care about labor and Medicare for all. But once you're out of the labor workforce because you can't work anymore, they don't understand that as a concept. They don't understand that those people's lives still happen and they need food. Like there are these blind spots, right? On the left, with Medicare for all and labor, but disability is not there. But disabled people get used to sell Medicare for all, even though a lot of us already have Medicare. So I'm trying to figure out, like, I've been so burned personally, professionally by like ableism on the left, how extreme it is. And I don't know if it's fixable. And I don't know if it's a bug or a feature.
So
because I think it might be a feature.
I think.
Did that make sense?
It does, because I believe that there is an obsession with the work ethic by Americans. And I believe that sometimes this obsession with the work ethic extends to so-called leftists who valorize work to this degree that they don't really consider the people who are not included in their view of work. You see this in attitudes towards criminalized workers, be it immigration or sex work or drugs. You see lots of conflicting ideas about this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's that same issue where you really have a hard time embracing disability rights if you've over-valorized the idea of the worker, which is not to say that the working class is not important or that we should not think of disabled people as part of the working class, regardless of whether they work or not, because they are in the same dependent position that the rest of us are. And also because their labor is exploited, even if they're disabled people.
How is labor exploited if you're not working?
Well, how many disabled people? Well, this can be fair. I know disabled people who volunteer more than they should.
Yeah.
And their labor is exploited by people who know they're disabled, but who call upon them to do more to meet certain activity requirements. Yeah. I have a friend who who was part of a group that left DSA or was thrown out, depending on whether you ask them or DSA. And one of the things was that volunteer time requirements to be listened to were ableist against those who volunteered as much as they could, but simply could not when health prevented it.
Yeah. Because I think about like the version of the left that was in the 60s, and they were not so focused on having jobs, but the economy kind of allowed it that more.
Counterculture allowed ways to get by.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like a lot of them. It just feels very nerdy, and it also feels very
also culture.
Like everyone, they want all these leftists to be the same and talk in this weird jargon, and it's like it's very strange to me. It's not cool at all.
So the trouble is there isn't a movement. There are various fractured groups. Things that are important to remember from the Bernie campaign are things like, Bernie is the compromise.
Yeah.
Now, when you think about what that means, you're not talking about people who are diehard Bernie supporters who are devoted to the idea of the kind of country Bernie is talking about. You're talking about people who are much more extreme than Bernie, who are willing to see Bernie as a compromise rather than their preferred version of the socialist future.
Yeah.
And those different visions are competing in many cases. And Bernie was a compromise these competing visions could, to some degree, come together around. But Bernie made it clear, once he didn't win, he was for Biden. I was never for Biden. I'll be honest.
No, what a disaster. You got me thinking about something I think about a lot too, which is utopia to a lot of leftists. And I kind of get snarky about this, but a lot of the utopian visions of cities and people living on top of each other and car-free culture, I think it's sort of like aesthetic, and I don't know how much of it is based in principle. And it's also like dystopic to me. You know what I mean?
I will be honest in that I do believe that there should be an ideal for a car-free culture, but, and I think this is an important but, public transportation has to be free, accessible, and 24/7 to ever get there.
Yeah.
And those are the three things that are never going to happen under capitalism. You're never going to have free, 24/7 accessible public transportation under this system.
Yeah. And by accessible, you also mean like gets you from a place near your home to a place.
Because that's an issue for me, even being able to walk and get around and physically being able. That doesn't mean I want to walk a half a mile to a bus stop every morning.
Right. Well, I mean, there's just like so much to, some people don't understand that disability could also encompass like what kind of noise level you could tolerate, whether or not you can breathe outside. Not everybody can breathe outside. And like a lot of people are sort of these, like some of the like leftist environmental utopia starts to sound like Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale, where it's like a nightmare to me because I actually live and die by air conditioning, and would that I didn't, but I do. And isn't my survival important?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
And this is why I say seriously that the ideal should be the joke of fully automated gay space communism.
Right.
I mean, and not necessarily everybody has to be gay, but pro-gay, gay friendly, welcoming. It's just, that's what we should be striving for. Everybody should be able to have a comfortable life with the pursuit of happiness. And by the pursuit of happiness, I mean what Jefferson, for all his other immense flaws, meant by the pursuit of happiness, which is that people should be able to do what they want, and still support themselves, which is very different from how we read the ability to try to be happy into that now, when what it really means is people should be able to follow the pursuit, the career path that they want, and be able to support themselves regardless.
Yeah. I think what bothers me about a lot of the car-free discourse is that like you can't, I am environmentally sensitive. I've lived through hurricanes and wildfires. Like I needed a car for that. And maybe it's just that I'm too survivalist oriented, and I kind of wish there were political groups or just in general more awareness of like survivalism, because a lot of what people want to impose on all of us towards some kind of utopia, like taking away the plastic and this, that, and that, is they're not willing to see the harm that could cause. You know what I mean? And so, yes, I understand. Like, I understand we're careening into the apocalypse. I've lived it. Like I said, hurricanes and wildfires, like multiple, and 9/11 exploding down the street from my job. Like, I've lived through all of that. So you can't tell me what I need or don't need. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
And that's sort of a matter of like which voices get centered. You know, in actual environmental justice movements, the idea is that the first and worst affected should be leading. Like nothing is led by us. We can't even get a seat at most tables. You know, like we are getting actively really dismissed.
And let's look at the representation you've got. Tammy Duckworth is not looking out for other people in wheelchairs. Can we all say this?
Right. Or she would have passed a law that airlines have to refund your full week. Like there's so many basic things that could be done right now for wheelchair users. Like they can't travel without their ability to move getting completely dismantled, you know, almost every time. You hear that all the time. And that would be such an easy fix. Like how easy would it be to pass a law like with liability and restrictions, or making a place on planes for like that's just so easy.
And the simple fact is, and people used to understand this, the reason that you pass regulations is not because you want to be cruel and over-regulate corporations. It's because regulations are how you tell corporations you're serious about it.
Yeah.
If they know that they'll get punished if they break the rules, then they know you're serious about the rules. Right. If the regulations are just guidelines, the way so much COVID stuff ended up being, people don't care. That's the thing about mandates. The reason that I was for vaccine mandates is because I hate needles. And I need people to tell me I have to get vaccinated. And yes, maybe that's selfish, but you know, that's something that needs to be taken into account. I can't be the only person who thinks that way. And what's more, there have to be people who are anti-mandate for the same reason I'm pro-mandate. They just don't like needles.
Yeah. COVID vaccine mandate is a tough one, though.
So,
by and large, that's the disability community's position, because where we're at with that technology.
The most pro-mandate person I know who couldn't be with us tonight because she's still not feeling well after her surgery is Amanda Seaby, who was the candidate to be my congresswoman here in Oregon a couple of years ago. It would have been so perfect. I would have been so happy. I would have believed in the Democrats if they had nominated and elected Amanda Seaby. But they didn't, so I don't.
Next time.
No, if she runs again, it's an independent. She's been pretty official about that.
Yeah.
But no, she's the most pro-mandate person I know, and she can't be vaccinated. And that's why she's so pro-mandate. Right. As long as there's medical exemption and stuff, definitely. Because her position is simply the realistic one, that not being vaccinated, I need more, not being able to be vaccinated, I need even more vaccinated people around me.
Yeah. Yeah, this COVID thing is wild, man. I think I have very low expectations of humanity, and I would not have expected it to be this low. I would not have expected it to go from well, please wear a mask, to people like Leanna Wen saying, well, we want to see your smile, so don't wear a mask.
So now that you know that my whole view of race and differently abled people and gender and everything else is formed by 80s inspiration porn.
Yes.
You will understand why I say that I thought that Donald Trump's election as president was the most disillusioning experience of my life. And then COVID happened.
It's way worse.
Yes.
And honestly, Biden's leadership is way worse to me.
Well, so let's be honest. Let's be honest. When the two things that I expected from Biden were sensible COVID policy and saving the post office. Those were my only expectations for Joe Biden.
Those were mine. they weren't my expectations, but they were my reasons to vote for him.
Yeah. I didn't vote for him.
Although my vote didn't get counted, it sat in the post office. So I'm in Florida. So
well, no, I was I was one of the people who, well, no, I have not been able to properly register to vote since moving to Oregon from Tennessee because I refused to pay for an Oregon ID for
right.
$75 when
Yeah.
I can't drive and I have a permanent ID from Tennessee.
So do you vote in Tennessee?
I probably should try to figure out if I can.
I mean, to be honest, I don't care. Like, I don't care about voting.
Yeah.
I didn't vote this year. Like, we don't need to have that conversation.
Yeah, but right now I'm a non-voter.
Yeah, me too. But I felt
when I lived in Tennessee, I very actively voted blue just to spite my neighbors.
Right. Like, I definitely had the same too. They weren't expectations for me, but I thought, well, and I knew, actually, I was like, wow, Biden's policy on COVID is really bad, but it can't be worse than Trump. And it's way worse. It's like way worse.
Trump would have been scared of Trump would have been scared of losing to Democrats if he lifted COVID restrictions. Yeah. Biden had already beaten Trump.
Yeah.
And wasn't scared of the consequences of lifting COVID restrictions.
Biden fucking sucks.
So
Biden is fearless. That's the thing about Trump, is that what was so terrible about Trump is the state of anxiety he always had us in. That's not nothing. Like, it's not reality, but it isn't nothing to be constantly anxious that this person is going to do absolutely nuts things that is going to, like, harm, mass harm. But
at the same time, he was afraid of consequences.
Yes.
Trump has been afraid of consequences all his life, even though he's never had to actually face them. Right. Biden is not afraid of consequences. Biden knows how the system works and knows that he will never be held accountable for anything he does.
This is a fucking nightmare. And I deal with it every day because of how high risk I am, how I don't have T cells because of that stupid COVID infection. Like, I'm fucking...
Biden has increased my anxiety over where it was when Trump was president.
It's so much worse. And he took away everything, all these economic protections, and he set us up for worse and worse fascism. I mean, Jesus. And he was always this guy. And also,
always this guy. Always. He ran on this in 2008. He ran on being I'm the Democrat who's really a Republican in 2008.
And he doesn't care at all. Like, he doesn't.
I have zero empathy.
Trump was, like, constantly wanting to be liked.
Yes.
Playing that dynamic.
Yeah,
a lot of things are worse than policing too.
Trump's narcissism. Trump's narcissism meant that he wanted to be liked by everyone he was in the room with at the moment he was in the room with them. Which, was the only good thing one can say about him. Now, obviously, it meant that bad people could take advantage of him, but it also meant that people could get him to do good things that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
100%. And he was,
this is a small symbolic thing, and a lot of people don't care. But do you have any idea how long people have been trying to get Jack Johnson pardoned for marrying a white woman? Because Jack Johnson was convicted of violating the Mann Act, which was known in those days as the White Slavery Act. And Johnson's crime was traveling across state lines with his fiancée.
Yeah.
Since they weren't married yet, this was for sexual purposes.
Right.
So this was extremely racist. If they had been a white engaged couple, he would not have been arrested.
Right.
If his wife was a black woman, he would not have been arrested. This happened specifically because he was a black man engaged to a white woman and traveling with her.
Yeah.
Trump pardoned Jack Johnson. John McCain had tried to get both Bushes to pardon Johnson. and they wouldn't do it. And Donald Trump just pardoned Jack Johnson in addition to all the bad people he pardoned.
Well, the other thing about Trump, which is related to that, was that he played up on economic populism. And even though it was mostly fraudulent, there was some trace of it. And if he knew that it could help him win something or gain something, he would easily send out a check or do XYZ. And Biden is so extreme in the other direction. He really like hates poor people and he hates giving anything back.
Well,
and I'm scared of Medicare getting cut.
Got a secret for you. I know this because a former friend of mine is an anti-masker and COVID denier now, and became a DeSantis fan. But the parts of Miami and Miami Beach that were pro-mask got lots of masks from Donald Trump because he wanted to do Ron DeSantis political favors. And Ron DeSantis wanted those parts of Miami and Miami Beach to vote for him and not whatever Democrat ran against him. So the pro-masking parts of Miami and Miami Beach early on in COVID got all the masks they wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm in South Florida now. You're in Oregon?
I'm in Oregon. I'm outside Portland.
Oh, okay.
Portland is like any other big city in the U.S. with a fascist Democrat for mayor.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. And he also runs the police department. Is that right?
Yes. Tear gas Ted Wheeler is also the police commissioner. Now, there's like two other police commissioners. It's a commission. There's a 3-person commission, and it's the chief of public safety, who is the day-to-day commander. But ultimately, Ted's in charge because he's on the commission and he's mayor.
Listen, you are a very interesting person. Like, talking to you is different in a good way. I had seen some of your shows and I sort of knew how it went, but I also do shows where people are very kind of like on topic. And so this was like, it was good. I wish I knew. I love talking about television. I just wish I had known more of your references because I could talk about TV all day. And it's not age. I just like.
Now, if you ever want to totally bash Seinfeld or Friends, I can do that too.
Yeah, that needs to happen.
LA Law.
LA Law was great. I was fucking in love with that show.
Now, see, we can talk about LA Law sometime.
Yeah.
I can explain that would give me the chance to tell people why the LA Law reunion movie was the only TV reunion movie that was ever done right.
Wait, there was an LA Law reunion movie?
Yes, there was.
When?
Oh, it was before I moved from California to the U.S., so it had to be the late 90s or like 2000, 2001.
Wasn't there a bisexual character on LA Law?
Yes, there was, but she was not in the reunion. The reunion was only the people from the original cast plus Benny. So there's no Jimmy Smits. There's no Amanda Donahoe. That was CJ, the bisexual character. There's no John Spencer. None of the people who came in later. No Blair Underwood.
So Harry Hamlin.
It's Harry Hamlin, Susan Day, Richard Dysart, Alan Ratchins, Corbin Burnson.
Who was Corbin
married
Burnson?
couple, Michael Tucker and Jill Eikenberry.
Who was
Susan Rattan?
Who was Corbin Burnson's secretary again?
Susan Rattan.
Right.
And then his other secretary was Gwen Cooper later on, who's Sheila Kelly, who's real life.
Yeah.
What was that?
She's married to somebody.
Yeah, she is. Her real life husband is same last name as a congressman. Richard Schiff. Her real life husband is Richard Schiff, who was Toby Ziegler on The West Wing.
I never watched The West Wing.
I watched The West Wing, and I watched The West Wing enough to know why even liberal fans of The West Wing should be disappointed by Joe Biden.
What do you mean? Because I don't watch that show.
So Obama Obama's administration was in love with the West Wing aesthetic.
Yes, yes. I feel like there are people that are both. Yeah.
Biden's first press secretary, who's on MSNBC now, Jen Psaki.
Yeah.
Since she worked for the Obama administration, has pictured herself as CJ Craig, Allison Janney's character on The West Wing. And this shows in the way she does her hair and did her press conferences. And it's just, it's scary how you can see which characters these people think they are. But all at the same time, they would be such a disappointment to the real West Wing characters because they don't care about any of these things for real. And the one thing that everybody on the West Wing had in common for all their other faults is they really gave a shit about this stuff and they wanted to accomplish more than they were accomplishing. And they were constantly disappointed by the limits of what they could do.
Yeah.
These people seem very comfortable with the limits of what they can do.
Yeah. Didn't Biden hire a whole family, like pure nepotism, pure trading favors, trying to get the Emmanuels, Raul and
oh yes, both Ram and his brother, the doctor. Zeke.
But there was a whole other family, like Walter Schaub was writing about it, like a whole other family where the whole family works there. It feels very dark. And
I don't know as much about that. I mean, the one thing I know is that at least Hunter hasn't been given a job yet.
That we know of, right?
Well, you know what my conspiracy theory is, right?
No.
My conspiracy theory is that the whole time that Hunter was in Ukraine, he was a CIA agent.
Oh.
And the reason I say this is threefold. First, CIA really does recruit famous people or the relatives of prominent people for their access to places that ordinary people can't go.
Right.
They used George Bush. They used Poppy Bush's oil company for that for years in Mexico. The second is that he was thrown out of the army for his drug problem.
Yeah.
Sheep dipping, giving someone in the military a criminal record so that they have a legitimate cover to be approached by shady people is something the CIA does. If you have ever either seen the movie with Michael Caine, the Ipcress File, or read the book by Frederick Forsyth, the main character in these stories is a counterfeiter who is running a counterfeiting scam while serving with the British military in Germany. He is caught and he is sheep dipped out of the military so that he can become a British spy.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I've seen movies like that too.
The La Femme Nikita's whole premise is actually using criminals to do covert operations.
Yeah, I mean, that might make some sense. I've definitely had the feeling that the world's going to blow up because of Hunter Biden. It definitely, and then it sort of happened, we're getting
But it's so on the one hand, this is just a little too, this looks like the ordinary nepotistic stuff that happens with people's families because people want access to important people. And Trump knows that. And Trump does all these same things himself and makes all these same deals. So why would he obsess on Hunter Biden so much unless he thinks there's something else there?
I don't know. Trump obsessed on Rosie O'Donnell.
That's true. Trump is a weird guy.
I'm not against your theory. I definitely have felt that Hunter Biden is doomed to be the end of us. It has felt inevitable to me. And then things
if you
read it that way.
If you wanted to send somebody to the Ukraine to be approached by seedy Russians or seedy Ukrainians, wouldn't you give a drug-addled relative of a politician a board seat on an energy company in Ukraine? He's guaranteed to be approached by shady people.
I think you're onto something.
I think there's a novel there, even if it's not true.
No, I'm leaning more towards it than against. I should get going, but I want to give you my conspiracy theory before I go.
Sure.
I read this somewhere that the reason that the Biden administration stopped even recommending masks and started to recommend not wearing masks is because of facial recognition technology. Have you heard that one?
I would believe it.
Yeah,
I know that Biden was really, really sucking up to cops, that cops are really, really, really against masks, both on a personal level and on a professional level.
Yeah.
That they really hate the idea of being made to mask themselves, but they also really hate the idea of being around lots of masked people.
Yeah. Yeah. Just the way that it pivoted, where suddenly it was like, maybe you shouldn't wear masks because we want to see your smile. They harm children. Like it did this very sharp, weird pivot.
Well, it was like all of a sudden the media and the Democratic Party establishment accepted all the Republican ideas about masks that they had been making fun of as facts.
Yeah.
Like they had always agreed all along and were just pretending.
Yeah. And I've seen that in the left as well now. You know, it is. And again, maybe this is autistic brain, but I tend to expect people to mean what they say, like to have principles.
Yes.
And people just don't at all. Like they don't. They're just going with whatever.
This is why there's no revolution, because we don't have people who have principles that they will put above their own welfare. I mean, you can say what you want about Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and criticize them in all sorts of ways, but they actually cared about what they were doing during the revolution, whatever happened later. They really thought that what they were doing was important and was going to save people. And they thought it was worth doing.
Yeah.
And, you know, in 1915, no one thought they would win in 1918. So you have to have people who really do want to organize and really do care enough to do the kinds of things that people do if they want to actually overthrow a system. I mean, when people talk about anything that would actually be necessary to overthrow the system, and I don't care if you advocate it or not. I don't care if you advocate for it or not, but if you really believe, I lost my train of thought. If you really believe something, you should be willing to risk something for it. If you really want things to get better, you should be willing to risk losing. And I don't think anybody's willing to take any risks.
Well, that's sort of a tall order for disabled people.
No, that's true. That's true. Well, you take risks every day. I'm not asking you to take more risks than you already do.
But if I knew what that path was to make life better so that people don't have to go through what I go through, I would do it. It's not there yet. I feel like we're just starting to organize, and we can't organize locally because there's just so much ableism in every local community.
Yes.
So we're finding each other on the internet. We're starting to form communities, and but our discourse, like our very simple discourse, like, hey, please don't make fun of food delivery services. Please don't pick on this girl because she can only eat something. The backlash is so fucking intense and vile that it's like, I don't know. I feel like I'm at square one with politics, and I don't even know where to go except to survive myself.
Well, and I mean, honestly, and I'm by no means a folk who fan, But Michel Foucault talks about biopolitics, which when every decision means some people live and some people die.
Yeah.
And we're in that area where really the big decisions are all these biopolitical decisions now that involve life and death.
Yeah.
We have to either continue and expand social services to stop people from dying, or we continue to contract them and more people die. This is a serious question. It's not a hypothetical. It's a question of, do we want to stop people from dying or not? So when we talk about healthcare, the question is, how many lives do we actually want to save? And are we willing to do what needs to be done? Because Medicare for all isn't enough. The Canadian system is good, but in Canada, they're forcing through, they're trying to get assisted suicide passed in order to free up social services money.
Yeah.
There was a really disturbing interview with somebody who wasn't going to qualify for enough benefits, but could get help dying, so he didn't want to be homeless.
Oh yeah, that's happening all over the place in Canada right now. And I don't think that anybody's ready for the disabled critique of Medicare for all, because it's complicated. It's about, or for public, obviously public health is better than what we have. But at the same time, it's like some of us have rare diseases and the public health system isn't going to want to deal with that. Some of us need certain kinds of medication and we're already fighting for it, and that would be harder. I think it's just that it all feels very fascist and eugenicist right now. And so I've slipped into a mode of just like pure survivalism. And I think a lot of people are.
Well, that's why what I do more than anything else right now is speak out about what I see as the fascist tendencies that are going on around us.
Yeah.
And where I see people trying to compromise with them too much on what is supposedly the left.
Right. I'm sorry, I'm getting sleepy.
No, it's around the time where, yes, you've done more than your promised hour, so we should let you go.
It's really interesting talking to you. You're a fascinating person. You're very smart. I almost kind of now look back on our conversation and wish I had listened more than I talked, even, because I can learn a lot from you. You read more. Like I did all that reading so long ago and I haven't been keeping up with it, but we should talk again, find some more shared television references. I'm going to watch the LA Law reunion.
Yeah,
they were also skinny.
So the spoiler almost isn't a spoiler, but so in the very first episode of LA Law, Harry Hamlin is representing a convicted murderer who he knows is innocent, who he's trying to get out. And it's the last chance and they lose.
Oh.
And that's in the very first episode of LA Law.
Right. Okay.
And in the reunion movie, Richard Dysart is asking Harry Hamlin to come out of semi-retirement since his firm failed after he left in the original show, in order to represent this same guy again, because it turns out he's going to have one more chance. And that's the beginning of the reunion movie. And of course, it's LA Law, so there's subplots around all the characters. But that's what brings Harry Hamlin back.
That's pretty good.
And it's like I said, it's the only reunion movie that TV has ever actually gotten 100% right, in my opinion.
What other reunion movies, and then we'll go, what other reunion movies are there?
More than you would want to remember, actually. There were 3 $6 Million Man Bionic Woman reunion movies.
Okay.
There was a Get Smart reunion movie. There was even a revival Get Smart TV series for a little while. There was, I'm trying to think of the others. There was a Maverick reunion movie that became a second Maverick TV series. There was a Kenny Rogers gambler movie that ended up being a reunion movie for almost anyone who was ever on a CBS Western.
Okay, but like, no disrespect, you don't seem 70 years old, but a lot of these references are like very old.
I also grew up in the 90s, so TV Land.
Right.
Back when it was still TV Land.
I'm gonna sign off. I'm not good at goodbyes. It's an autistic thing. I usually just try to get out of spaces.
Of course.
Can you say goodbye?
You have a great night.
Thank you. You too.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. And everybody else, you guys have a great night, and we'll tweet at you.